Elena Mercer sat at the edge of the cafe window, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as she watched the city bustle below. The soft hum of conversations and clinking cutlery felt distant, almost intrusive, but she welcomed the noise as a distraction from the storm in her mind. At 28, Elena had perfected the art of appearing composed while inside. Emotions raged like wild currents. Today, however, composure felt brittle, like a fragile sheet of ice threatening to crack under the weight of a secret she couldn't yet name aloud. Across the table, her friend and colleague, Julian Hayes, tapped on his laptop with casual efficiency, completely unaware of the tension radiating from Elena. Julian was the kind of man who seemed effortless, 32, dark-haired, with a subtle confidence that made him magnetic without trying. Elena had always admired him professionally, but lately, the admiration had shifted, twisting into something she couldn't quite reconcile with her loyalty to her long-term boyfriend, Marcus. Marcus, her anchor, her safe harbor, was the kind of man who made promises like currency and kept them with unwavering fidelity. Yet, as stable and reliable as he was, their relationship had begun to feel predictable. Comfort had replaced excitement, routine had replaced passion, and somewhere in that monotony, Elena felt a creeping emptiness she couldn't shake. The cafe door swung open, and a brisk breeze carried in the scent of rain-soaked streets. Elena glanced up instinctively, her pulse quickening, not for the weather, but because someone new had entered, someone who shifted the air in subtle but undeniable ways. Nathan Cole. She remembered his name from the art exhibit last week, though they had barely spoken beyond polite introductions. Now, he was here, leaning casually against the counter with a sketchbook tucked under one arm, eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity that felt almost intrusive. Julian's voice snapped her back. "You're distracted," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" Elena forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just lost in thought." She didn't mention Nathan, didn't explain the inexplicable pull she felt towards someone she barely knew. It wasn't that she was unhappy with Marcus. It was more complicated than that. Nathan represented a spark, a dangerous possibility that had no place in her ordered life, but made her heartbeat skip anyway. The afternoon wore on, and Elena found herself sketching in her notebook, a nervous habit she had picked up when indecision gnawed at her. Her pencil traced shapes and lines that made no sense to anyone but her, a private language of anticipation and tension. She kept stealing glances at Nathan, who now sat at a corner table, sketching fervently, oblivious to the world around him. There was something about the way he lost himself in his work, a kind of freedom Elena hadn't felt in years. Julian noticed her gaze. "You know," he said with a smirk, "if you stare at him any longer, people might start thinking you're plotting something." Elena laughed, but it was sharp and unconvincing. She returned to her sketches, her mind unraveling into scenarios she would never voice aloud. Fleeting touches, whispered conversations, and moments of reckless abandon. Every thought felt forbidden, yet exhilarating by the time she left the cafe. The sky had turned an iron gray, and rain began to patter against the streets. She pulled her coat tighter, a futile attempt to shield herself from the chill. Nathan's sketchbook caught her eye again as she passed, and for a brief moment, their eyes met across the street. A flash of recognition, and something more, passed between them. It was a silent acknowledgement of the unspoken tension, an electric current that neither of them could yet name. Elena walked home in a daze, the familiar route now feeling foreign. Her apartment smelled of Marcus's cologne lingering faintly on the coat he had left on the chair, a comforting reminder, and yet, a weight she no longer wanted to bear entirely. She set her keys down and sank onto the sofa, letting her thoughts swirl uncontrollably. Nathan's presence lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake, and with it came a thrill that frightened her as much as it excited her. That evening, Marcus called. His voice was warm, ordinary, familiar, a stark contrast to the chaos brewing in Elena's chest. He asked about her day, about work, about mundane details that should have made her smile. Instead, she found herself answering mechanically, her mind replaying stolen glances and imagined encounters. "Everything okay?" Marcus asked, a slight furrow in his brow. Elena hesitated. Could she confess the swirl of conflicting emotions, the magnetic pull she felt towards someone she barely knew? No, she thought, shaking her head softly. "Yeah, just tired," she lied, a simple answer that felt like a betrayal in itself. The conversation ended, and Elena sat in silence, the apartment now a sanctuary and a prison all at once. She felt torn between two worlds. The safe, predictable life she had built with Marcus and the dangerous, thrilling possibility that Nathan represented. It wasn't just attraction, it was the allure of an uncharted path, one that promised excitement but demanded a reckoning with her own morals and desires. As night fell, Elena made a quiet decision. She would see Nathan again. Not tonight, not impulsively, but soon. She needed to understand why her heart responded to him with such intensity. And perhaps, in understanding, she would either extinguish the spark or surrender to it entirely. Either way, she knew one thing. Her life was about to change, irrevocably. And as she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the first drops of rain tapped against her window, mirroring the restless rhythm of her own pulse. Change was coming, and Elena could no longer pretend she was untouched by it. The next morning began with a quiet tension that Marissa Caldwell could not ignore. Sunlight slipped through the apartment windows, but the warmth it carried did little to ease the heaviness in the room. Ethan Caldwell stood at the kitchen counter preparing coffee while scrolling through his phone. His expression was distant, the same distracted look Marissa had noticed so often in recent weeks. She sat at the table, watching him silently for a moment. "Ethan," she said finally as he looked up briefly. "Yeah. Can we talk?" Ethan paused, setting his phone down slowly. "Sure." Marissa folded her hands together, trying to find the right words. "When was the last time we actually talked about us?" Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean really talked," she said. "Not about bills or schedules or work." Ethan leaned against the counter, clearly unsure where the conversation was heading. "I thought things were fine," he replied. Marissa exhaled softly. "That's the problem," she said. "You think everything is fine." Ethan crossed his arms. "Where is this coming from?" Marissa hesitated before answering. She didn't want to turn the moment into an argument, but she also couldn't ignore the truth she had been carrying. "We barely spend time together anymore," she said. "You're always working late. When you are home, we barely speak." Ethan shrugged lightly. "It's just a busy period at work." Marissa looked at him carefully. "Is it?" The question hung in the air. For a brief second, Ethan's expression shifted, almost like he had been caught off guard. But the moment passed quickly. "Of course it is," he said. Marissa nodded slowly, though she wasn't sure she believed him. Silence filled the kitchen again. Ethan grabbed his jacket from the chair. "I'm already running late," he said. "We can talk about this tonight." Before Marissa could respond, he picked up his keys and headed toward the door. The apartment fell quiet once again after he left. Marissa remained at the table for several minutes, staring at the untouched coffee in front of her. The conversation had barely begun, yet it already felt unfinished. Later that afternoon, she arrived at the bookstore earlier than usual. The familiar scent of paper and polished wood greeted her as she stepped inside. The calm atmosphere instantly felt more comfortable than the tension she had left behind at home. Daniel Hayes was kneeling near the front shelf, organizing a stack of novels. He looked up when he heard the door. "Hey," he said with a warm smile. "You're early today." Marissa placed her bag behind the counter. "Couldn't sit around the apartment," she admitted. Daniel studied her expression briefly. "Rough morning?" Marissa nodded. "I tried talking to Ethan, and—" She sighed quietly. "He says everything is fine." Daniel stood up slowly. "That doesn't sound convincing." "It didn't feel convincing either," Marissa replied. They began arranging books together while the afternoon light streamed through the windows. For a while, neither of them spoke. Finally, Daniel said, "Sometimes people avoid the truth because facing it would force them to change something." Marissa glanced at him. "You think that's what's happening?" Daniel shrugged gently. "I think only Ethan can answer that." Marissa ran her fingers along the spine of a novel. "I don't want my marriage to fall apart," she said quietly. Daniel's voice remained calm. "Wanting something and ignoring reality are two different things." The words weren't harsh, but they carried weight. As the day passed, customers came and went, bringing brief distractions from Marissa's thoughts. Why evening the bookstore returned to its usual calm. They locked the doors together as the sky turned dark outside. Daniel leaned against the counter, thoughtful. "You know," he said slowly, "whatever happens between you and Ethan, you deserve clarity." Marissa nodded. "I know." They stepped outside into the cool night air. The city seemed quieter tonight, the distant traffic fading into the background. They walked slowly along the sidewalk, neither of them in a hurry to break the peaceful moment. "Thank you," Marissa said suddenly. Daniel glanced at her. "For what?" "For listening," she replied. "Most people just give advice." Daniel smiled faintly. "Listening usually helps more." They reached the entrance of her apartment building again. the same place where they had parted the night before. Marissa paused near the doorway. "I'm going to talk to Ethan again tonight," she said. Daniel nodded approvingly. "That sounds like the right step." Marissa looked up at the building's dimly lit windows. For the first time in weeks, she felt a sense of determination rather than confusion. "Whatever the truth is," she continued, "I need to know." Daniel's expression softened. "That takes courage." She gave a small smile. "Maybe I finally have some." They stood there for another brief moment before Marissa reached for the door. "Good night, Daniel." "Good night, Marissa." She entered the building and slowly climbed the stairs once again. When she unlocked the apartment door, the lights were already on. Ethan sat in the living room, just as he had the night before. But tonight Marissa didn't hesitate. She closed the door behind her and walked directly toward him. "We need to finish the conversation we started this morning," she said calmly. Ethan looked up, surprised by the firmness in her voice. The quiet room suddenly felt smaller, for the first time in a long while. Neither of them seemed able to avoid what had been building between them. And as Marissa stood there waiting for Ethan to respond, she realized that whatever happened next would finally reveal the truth about the life they had been living together. The weekend arrived with a heavy, humid weight, pressing against Elena's chest as though the air itself knew the turmoil inside her. She had spent the days since the coffee shop in a fog of distracted routines, going through motions with Marcus, smiling when necessary, nodding at conversations, and pretending that her heart was entirely present. Yet every moment was punctuated by the memory of Nathan's gaze, his easy laughter, the way he had listened like she was the only person in the world who mattered. Marcus had planned a quiet Saturday morning hike. He wanted to reconnect, to share breakfast, to remind Elena of the life they had built together. She agreed, masking the anxiety simmering just beneath her skin. As they drove toward the trailhead, Marcus chatted about work, about mutual friends, about trivial plans for the upcoming week. Elena responded politely, her voice even, but inside, a storm raged. Every text notification made her flinch. Every passing stranger seemed like a reflection of what she might have with Nathan. A freedom, an unpredictability, an uncharted thrill that by mid-morning, they had reached a scenic overlook, the sun casting golden hues across the valley below. Marcus pulled Elena close, wrapping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him out of habit, out of loyalty, yet her mind wandered to Nathan, to the way he had lingered near her at the cafe, the way he had touched her hand accidentally, or so she told herself. A pang of guilt struck her chest, sharp and undeniable. That evening, Marcus returned to work on a project he had promised to finish by Monday, leaving Elena alone in the apartment. She told herself she would spend the evening reading, finishing sketches, or simply resting. But instead, her phone buzzed, a message from Nathan. "Hey, I was thinking about the project. Want to meet and finalize some details?" Elena hesitated, staring at the screen. The rational part of her mind screamed to decline, to preserve the life she had committed to. The other part, restless and impatient, whispered that this was more than work, that Nathan wanted her, truly, in ways that Marcus had never sought. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, indecision paralyzing her. Finally, she typed, "Okay, I'll meet you, just for a quick review." The cafe was quiet, the evening dim and nearly empty. Nathan was already there when she arrived, leaning back in a chair with an easy confidence that made her pulse spike. They sat close, elbows brushing as they passed papers and reviewed photographs. The air between them was taut, a current of unspoken anticipation, and Elena felt herself drawn to it like a moth to flame. Nathan's gaze met hers, steady and compelling. "You're distracted," he said softly, not accusing, only observing. Elena's cheeks warmed. I guess I've had a lot on my mind," she admitted. A pause followed, charged with meaning. She wanted to confess everything: her loyalty, her guilt, her growing desire. But the words faltered in her throat. A moment passed, heavy and suspended. Nathan reached over to point at a photograph, and their hands touched briefly. The contact was fleeting, yet it sent a jolt through Elena's body, one she couldn't ignore. She pulled back slightly, reminding herself that this was dangerous territory, but the magnetic pull toward him only intensified. Conversation shifted, slowly becoming personal, revealing fragments of their lives, dreams, fears, frustrations. Nathan listened with intensity, nodding, smiling, responding in ways that made Elena feel deeply seen. She realized she hadn't experienced this level of attention in years, not from Marcus, not from anyone. And in that realization, the seeds of temptation blossomed, vivid and undeniable. Time passed unnoticed. Their review ended, but neither moved immediately to leave. The tension, unspoken but palpable, filled the small space between them. Elena's heart pounded as Nathan leaned slightly closer. She wanted to pull away, to remind herself of Marcus, of her promises, of the life she had pledged loyalty to. But she didn't. Instead, she allowed herself to stay, to linger in the suspended moment. Then, Nathan's phone buzzed, a reminder of obligations elsewhere. He glanced at it, smirked, and said, "I guess the world is still waiting for us to finish our responsibilities." His voice was light, almost teasing, but Elena felt a pang of disappointment. She realized she wanted the moment to stretch indefinitely, to escape into the thrill that pulsed between them as they walked outside. The night air cool against her skin, Nathan's hand brushed hers again, almost deliberately. Elena froze, aware of every second, every sensation. She glanced at him, searching his expression for meaning, for hesitation, for confirmation that this was mutual. He met her eyes with a quiet intensity, a shared acknowledgement that boundaries were being tested. Elena's phone vibrated. "Marcus. Can't wait to see you tonight. Dinner at 7. Her chest tightened. Guilt and desire collided violently inside her. She wanted to text back immediately, to reassure Marcus, to cling to the familiar love she had promised herself, yet the memory of Nathan's touch lingered, insistent and warm. That be why the time she returned home, her emotions were tangled beyond repair. Marcus greeted her with a smile, his hands brushing hers casually, oblivious to the inner storm. Elena returned the smile mechanically, voice light but distant. She prepared dinner with practiced efficiency, the smells of cooking masking the turmoil that gnawed at her heart. After dinner, Marcus left to make a quick call, leaving Elena alone in the dimly lit apartment. She sank onto the sofa, phone in hand, staring at Nathan's last message. "I feel like we're on the same page. Don't you?" The simple words reverberated in her mind. She knew she was crossing a line, inching closer to something that could shatter the life she had carefully built. And yet, part of her wanted to see how far it could go. Elena leaned back, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The tension inside her refused to settle, a restless energy that whispered promises and threats in equal measure. She understood, in that quiet moment, that the next decision she made would define everything. She could remain loyal, retreat to the safety of familiarity, or she could step further into the unknown, embracing desire and risking everything. And as the rain tapped softly against the windows, echoing the rhythm of her racing heart, Elena realized that the die was cast. The line had been crossed, not in action yet, but in intent, in awareness, in the undeniable pull of temptation. She had tasted the first hint of freedom and danger, and there was no turning back entirely. Elena woke to the sound of rain tapping insistently against the window, each drop echoing the rhythm of her unrest mind. Sleep had been shallow, fragmented by dreams she could barely distinguish from reality. Moments with Nathan flickering in and out, vivid and consuming. Marcus lay beside her, peaceful and trusting, oblivious to the turmoil that had already taken root. She stared at the ceiling, weighing the choices that had brought her to this precipice. By mid-morning, her apartment felt suffocating. She decided to take a walk, the city streets washed in a soft gray drizzle, mirroring her mood. Thoughts of Nathan were unavoidable, but so were thoughts of Marcus, whose love had always been unwavering. Elena's chest tightened with guilt as she remembered his last message. I love you. Don't be late. Every fiber of her being knew she was standing at the crossroads of desire and loyalty. Later, she found herself in the quiet sanctuary of the cafe where she and Nathan had met. He was there, already immersed in a sketch, as if the world outside the cafe had ceased to exist. The air between them was charged, and as soon as their eyes met, Elena felt the magnetic pull she had tried to resist. Nathan's expression was open, inviting, a mirror of the curiosity and longing she herself harbored. You look different today, he said softly, his voice careful but deliberate. There was no need for explanation. She understood exactly what he meant. She was a woman caught between two worlds, teetering on the edge of a choice that could redefine everything. Their conversation began with the pretense of work, reviewing photographs, discussing project details, but quickly drifted into territory more intimate. Every glance lingered longer. Every brush of the hand sparked tension. Nathan's presence was intoxicating. The way he listened, the way he responded with subtle intensity, and Elena realized that boundaries she had once considered immovable were now blurred lines. At T1 point, Nathan leaned closer, his shoulder nearly touching hers. I can tell when something's bothering you, he said quietly. Elena's lips parted, ready to confess, to speak the thoughts she had kept bottled for days. But she stopped, realizing that even admitting them aloud would change everything irreversibly. Her phone buzzed. Marcus, dinner tonight? I'll pick up your favorite. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She wanted to respond, to assure him she was still committed, but the words fell hollow. Nathan's gaze met hers again, and the unspoken understanding between them was undeniable. Elena realized that temptation was no longer a fleeting feeling. It had become a tangible, almost physical presence in her life. Time blurred as they lingered together. Rain streaked the windows, turning the outside world into a watercolor blur. Every laugh, every shared glance, every subtle touch heightened the intensity, making the ordinary feel electric. Elena's mind wrestled with morality, loyalty, and desire, each thought clashing violently against the other. Nathan's hand brushed hers again, lightly, almost accidentally. Elena felt a spark immediately, a jolt that made her pulse spike. She pulled back instinctively, reminding herself of Marcus, of promises, of love that had been steady and true for years. Yet, part of her resisted, tempted by the thrill and freedom Nathan represented. We shouldn't, she began, voice wavering. Nathan smiled softly, not pressuring, only acknowledging. I know, he said, but I also understand if you can't ignore this feeling either. His words were careful, measured, but they resonated with everything she had felt in the past week. Elena stared at him, the weight of her choices pressing down, suffocating yet exhilarating. That'd be why the time they parted that evening. Elena walked home through the wet streets in silence, the city lights reflecting in puddles like fractured memories. Her emotions were raw, unguarded, a storm she couldn't contain. She entered her apartment to find Marcus waiting, dinner on the table, his smile warm and unsuspecting. Long day, he asked, voice filled with gentle concern. Elena forced a smile, nodding. Yeah, busy, she replied, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. She realized that love and desire were not mutually exclusive. They could exist in tension, in conflict, but managing that tension required clarity she didn't yet possess. Dinner was quiet, punctuated by polite conversation, laughter that didn't quite reach her eyes, and a constant hum of internal conflict. Marcus noticed, briefly, the distraction in her gaze, but accepted it without question, trusting her implicitly. Elena's chest tightened again. Every fiber of her being ached with the knowledge that she was standing at the edge of a moral precipice. Later, she sat by the window, watching the rain blur the city into streaks of light and shadow. Marcus had gone to bed early, exhausted from his day, and she was left alone with her thoughts. Nathan's presence lingered in her mind, vivid and persistent. She knew she had to make a choice. Not tomorrow, not in a week, but now, before temptation led her further down a path she might not return from. The decision was terrifying in its clarity. To act on desire would bring momentary thrill, but permanent consequences. To retreat to loyalty would preserve stability, but leave a part of her yearning unfulfilled. Elena felt both the gravity and the freedom of choice pressing against her simultaneously. As the rain tapered off, leaving the streets glistening under the soft glow of streetlights, Elena understood something crucial. Life was a series of choices, and every choice carried weight. She could no longer drift, no longer pretend that temptation was a distant threat. It was here, tangible and real, and she would confront it with honesty, courage, and awareness of the cost. Elena closed her eyes, letting the silence of the apartment settle around her. The storm inside had not ended, but she had acknowledged it. She had recognized desire, temptation, and love not as opposing forces, but as intertwined elements of a complex human heart. And in that moment, she felt a strange clarity. Whatever path she chose next, it would define the person she would become. And she was ready to face that truth, no matter how difficult.